Today we have with us Dr. K.P. Krishnan, who is a retired civil servant, who has done, who was a lawyer, who was an economist, who was an academic, and who has thought a lot about the world on every single issue imaginable. He's currently the honorary chairperson at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. Today he's going to speak to us about central planning in urban development, the implications, and his big idea on that. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Mugdha. I am honorary chair professor.
Chair professor, sorry.
There is a separate board which runs CPR. Happy to be here. Excuse me. There are many big issues that one can potentially talk about, but given that we are in Mumbai for the Emerging Markets Conference, and that some of us are fresh from the discussion that followed Dr. Bimal Patel's presentation yesterday, I thought one big idea that we could talk about is the complete absence of any reform, market-based or otherwise, of India's urban planning. It sounds like a relatively trivial issue, but I've professionally as a civil servant spent time on that issue and have been reading about it in the context of building regulations looked at from the point of view of ease of doing business. And I think after yesterday's conversation, the larger macroeconomic and poverty impacts of this subject are actually very clear to me, and they are huge. So do you think that's a good topic, and do you think we can talk about that?
Yes, for sure. It would be really good to understand that what should be changed today, and if we could give some direction to urban planning in India, to the big cities or to the parts of the cities that are now being developed, what should that look like?
Yeah. So let's just step back and go to Econ 101. If you were to apply our standard public economics lessons on role of markets as distinct from role of the state, ordinarily our understanding is that markets work reasonably well in most routine activities of humans. There are areas where the markets are not necessarily the best solution. For instance, I'm sure you've read those books by Michael Sandel's on justice, where he talks about should there be a market for human organs. But we are not looking at anything as dramatic as that. We are looking at, let's say, urban land. The city of Mumbai or the city of Bangalore or the city of Chennai. And ordinarily, if you apply Econ 101, this is a market like any other, and ordinarily the state should intervene here if there is a clear case of a market failure. Now, if you take the urban landscape, typically there is unlikely to be information asymmetry, in the sense that there is land here and the land is visible. The potential of that land is a calculation that I make, that you make, and everybody else makes based on publicly available information, and hence a market for that piece of land should ordinarily not get hampered by information asymmetry. There are potentially likely to be a public goods issue and an externalities issue when it comes to urban living. Public goods in the form of, say, parks. Good quality urban living requires, let's say, excellent public roads, sidewalks, open spaces where people can meet, go for a walk, run, play, and these are classic examples of public goods which will not be provided by the market. So there will be a market failure. The state will need to provide these goods. Some of these goods also will have positive external economy, and therefore there is another reason why the state should intervene. Now, if you were to apply this lens and look at Mumbai, Chennai, Bangalore and Delhi, with such heavy state intervention in the urban land market, it's precisely these public goods that are entirely missing. Yesterday, Bimal Patel showed us that compared to New York, compared to London, compared to a whole bunch of other cities, which have between 50 and 60% of areas earmarked in in the public category, either public roads or parks and open spaces and classifications of this nature, most Indian cities are in the region of 10-12%. So we are an order of magnitude 5 times lesser than what would have been the case if there had been good quality state intervention. So to sort of quickly summarize, if one were to take a stab at this question from a very simple old style Econ 101 perspective, the need for state intervention is for provision of public goods and for merit goods. For the rest, the markets will function well. The heavy handed state interventions that have been done in our cities have actually done the exact opposite. They have completely killed the market for land and they have ended up under providing public goods. So I think this is the biggie which we need to tackle. And in case there is interest and time, we can come back to the question of what are the consequences of this huge state intervention, very badly done building regulations, etc.
So my question would be, when we speak of state intervention, there's two kinds. One is lawmaking, which is legislative. The other is executive. And here, if you were to give some advice to the decision makers on how they should prepare these regulations, and also on the person implementing it, a civil servant who might be listening to you and is inspired by your work, what would your advice be? How do they bring that Econ 101 perspective into their daily life?
I think the situation that we are in a lot of Indian cities, it's going to be difficult to do incremental interventions. I think it will be necessary to effectively, like somewhat similar to 1991, we'll have to go back to sort of a clean, fresh slate. We need to redo these regulations all over again, completely start from scratch. So to begin with, this classification of land and land use into residential, commercial, industrial, parks and open spaces, green space, I think all of this needs to be completely given up. Markets will primarily determine the best use to which the land can be put, given the standard objectives of markets. But given the emphasis that we've placed on public goods, perhaps all that the state or the urban development authority or the local body needs to do is decide based on the current data of the city, the quantum of land that is required for roads, for public spaces, and are there spatial considerations for locating these roads and public spaces in particular areas. Having done that, we would need to acquire that land, because a lot of that land is unlikely to be with the state, it's likely to be with the private sector. Now, there are various mechanisms by which this land is acquired. Should it necessarily be eminent domain using the sort of the monopoly violence power of the state by forcibly depriving people? No. There are mechanisms, for instance, the Ahmedabad Urban Development Authority in the early 2000, 2, 3, 4 till about 2010 pioneered these town development schemes where they would voluntarily acquire lands that were required for public purposes. For want of time, I will not go into the detail, but there are mechanisms by which land can be acquired. But I think in the Indian constitutional context, we would need legislative backing for these. I think mere executive action will not suffice.
And this will bring us to my final question, which is that one of the things we have seen is because of poor planning, there are a lot of parts of a city which were unzoned, and now they have been put to use through settlements which are considered illegal. They are labeled slums. And those people now have rights over that land because they have begun using that land. They have put it to some productive use. Should the state then intervene uh, and decide those rights? Should it acquire? How should these rights that have emerged, which were not there when in the initial conception of a city, how should they be treated?
I think if one were to be very legalistic about these rights, I think we'd have a very difficult situation in our hands, because in a very legalistic sense, these rights are not going to be very easy to establish. I think the way redevelopments have happened in a lot of the rest of the world is clear recognition of the fact that people are living in an area and figuring out ways in which that recognition can translate into legal rights, which means there will be need for legislation. But this matter, I think, gets complicated in India because there are a whole bunch of intermediaries who've come in, who've become quote unquote slumlords, who have begun to be the intermediaries between the state and the people. So I think in terms of ideal conceptual solutions, the state needs to figure out mechanisms. It could be through non-governmental organizations, it could be through civic society organizations, the people themselves, but clearly some kind of recognition of existing people, their rights of livelihoods and their rights of residence there, but all worked into a larger development landscape so that these get paid for, because a lot of these people will not necessarily be in a position to pay for these. From where will the resources come? They will need to come from redevelopment, for which somebody else will have to pay, and somebody will have to be willing to pay because he or she derives value. But I think on the fundamental point that you're raising, namely, can it be unmindful of the rights of the current quote unquote squatters? I think the clear answer is no.
Thank you so much, sir, for speaking to us about how what philosophy should planning and urban development focus upon, as we are moving into an era where we are seeing cities expand, we are seeing a lot of redevelopment, we are seeing a lot of development. What is the philosophy that we should turn to? So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mugdha.